Good evening and very warm welcome to the third of our series of Lent Lectures for 2021. As you may well know, these lectures have been organised by Reverend Gemma, and we're absolutely delighted that she has offered to give a lecture herself. The title of the lecture, Excited by Silence, is quite a striking one. Maybe she will encourage us to sit here for an hour in silence. Knowing her, I suspect not. I suspect she will have words of wisdom for us about how to use silence. Or certainly we should hear how it is that she finds silence exciting. I've no idea what she's going to say, but I'm really looking forward to it. So over to you, Gemma.
Well, good evening and welcome to this Lent Lecture. My name is Reverend Gemma Donnell and I am the Assistant Curate here in the parish of Finchampstead and California. It's my absolute pleasure to give you one of our Lent Lectures this year. I've been helping to organise them, and the range of different things that have been talked about and the different styles of the lectures have blown me away already. I'm very much looking forward to hearing more about creation, about the spoken word and about stained glass, all as they come up over the next few weeks. But as John said in his introduction, you would be forgiven for thinking that perhaps we would just have half an hour of silence now. And actually even giving a lecture on the topic of silence feels a little bit like a contradiction. And those of you who know me would be forgiven for thinking, why on earth is Gemma talking about silence when really all she does is talk? But silence is really important to me. And whilst I might be better equipped to give a lecture about intergenerational worship or crochet or cats, I wanted to share a little bit about my passion for silence and for contemplative worship. And hopefully it will inspire and encourage you to engage with this as well. Before I begin my lecture proper, I want to take just a moment to think about all the different images and ideas that silence evokes in us. So I'm going to read some quotes about silence, and I'm going to just show you some images that come up when I looked for the word silence in an image database. Silence is golden. Open your mouth only if what you are going to say is more beautiful than silence. True silence is the rest of the mind. It is to the spirit what sleep is to the body, nourishment and refreshment. Learn to get in touch with the silence within yourself and know that everything in life has purpose. Silence is golden. Unless you have children, then silence is suspicious. The ultimate tragedy is not the oppression and cruelty that is led by bad people, but the silence that good people hold in the face of that oppression. After silence, that which comes nearest to expressing the inexpressible is music. Silence comes in a lot of different ways. I wonder which one of those images or quotes sparked something in you or inspired you to think about how you see silence. We use silence in lots of different ways to describe different things, don't we? We talk about awkward silences, relaxing silences, nervous silences. You have attentive silences when people are hanging off your every word. And there's even inattentive silences where you say something to a room of people and nobody responds quite how you'd expect. But you know, I love all of those different ranges, and I love that silence is so inexplicable. And that's one of the reasons that I find it so exciting, that it does mean something different to other people. I'm just going to take a moment to define what I'm going to mean by silence as I go through with this lecture. But first I want you to just take a moment, stop and try and listen. See if there is silence around you now. You see, for me, instead of silence, what I hear is the sound of the television downstairs. I hear some noises muffled coming from next door. The water in the fish tank in my office moving around, the sound of the bin men doing their job. Perhaps some cars on a road nearby. You might hear the other people in your house, pets, anything like that. You might hear car doors slamming, music from the radio in the distance, birds singing. True silence, where there is no noise at all, is almost impossible to come by. And so what I want to define silence for the purposes of this lecture as is deliberately refraining from speaking or listening to outside sources of noise. So no music, no radio, no listening to the birds, deliberately choosing to focus on quiet internally as well as externally. And that is something that I think we really lack in our society. Everywhere you go, in shops, even sometimes in doctors' surgeries, in lifts, there's often music, background noise. People have bought headphones to drown out the silences that they get when perhaps they're running or walking. People use car stereos when they're driving. Even buses often have radio on. We live in a world where silence is not very fashionable and really inexplicable. There's another quote I like, which is by Aldous Huxley, that is, after silence, the nearest thing that comes to expressing the inexpressible is music. And I love that because it kind of taps into what I love about silence, is that it can be any number of different things. The same silence between me and a friend on one day could be really comfortable, but the next day for her mood or my mood or another situation, it could be really awkward or full of tension. And it's going to be different for you and for me how we experience silence. But I'm going to share with you just what it means for me. So I love silence because it's rare but needful. I love it because it's helpful, it's powerful, it's challenging, and possibly most importantly for me, it helps me to grow spiritually. Another quote that I really like, that I didn't include at the start of this lecture for reasons that will become obvious, comes from Lewis Carroll. And it's Alice speaking to the Mad Hatter. Alice speaks first, and then the Mad Hatter replies. "I don't think," Alice said. "Well, then you shouldn't speak," replied the Mad Hatter. I wonder how many of us have responded or reacted to things that have been said without thinking. I think if we held that proverb that I read earlier in the lecture about how we should only speak if we have something more beautiful to say than silence, like that would really change the world, wouldn't it? We just don't. I think sometimes we are too quick to express our opinions, and I speak as a general for everybody, not a specific person or even myself necessarily. Our world is quite often full of voices and not very full of listening. But I find silence to be really helpful for me. And that's not just a personal experience. You know, science suggests that spending time in silence helps to lower your blood pressure, which can help reduce heart attacks. It can boost the body's immune system. And a 2006 study says that 2 minutes of silence receives tension in the body and brain and is much more relaxing than any amount of listening to music. And another study, which came a little later in 2013, found that silence could create new cells in the hippocampus region of your brain, which is an area linked to remembering and developing emotions. So silence can genuinely be helpful for your body and your mind. I know spending regular time in silence has made me a better person because it's helped me to listen more and to develop patience. More research suggests that doing nothing and remaining silent can help you to increase your production and develop your imagination. Taking time to daydream or to just spend time with your own thoughts can actually improve your productivity. The other thing is that you get to know yourself better through silence. I don't know about you, but I find sometimes I'm so busy with the doing that I forget that I need to do being a person as well. And actually, I'm probably not as busy as many of you. Those of you with other responsibilities, people to care for, to cook for, work to do that's outside of the house, cooking, cleaning, ironing, washing, feeding people, getting people ready, looking after children, trying to keep in touch with your friends, trying to keep on top of emails, as well as engaging with the Lent lectures at church. I guess that must be really exhausting. And I know in my busyness that I often lose touch with who I am. At the end of a really busy week, I can sit down and go, actually, I feel rubbish. Why is that? Why do I feel so tired and so sad? Or so anxious and frustrated? And spending time in silence, letting the Holy Spirit guide me, unravelling and untangling the knots of my thoughts and experiences can help me to realise things about myself. Silence has helped me realise whether I really do or don't want to engage with a thing. Silence has helped me realise that I've said things I shouldn't have said. Silence has also helped me realise that I've left unsaid things that need to be said. It helps me to realise my own preferences even. I spent all week running around eating this food and that food and the other food, and actually I don't like some of it. But it's been convenient and easy. Why am I doing it then? Because it's convenient and easy, but I hadn't actually taken the time to realise that I don't enjoy it. Sometimes we are so busy that we lose ourselves, I think. And for me, I know that spending time in silence helps me to rediscover who I really am. And not just that, but it helps me to cut through what others say about me. And I think we forget that society impresses things upon us. You are this, you are that. Working mums are heroes, but they often don't have enough time for their kids. Mums who stay at home are also heroes, but they're also unfulfilled. Well, that might not be true. And sometimes thinking about things in the quiet helps me to go, actually, I don't know why I believe that about myself, because that's not who I am. For me, silence has helped me drill down into the core of who I am in God, and to be able to make changes that reflect that and to take better control of my life. But it's also made me a better person towards others. Spending time unwinding things makes me calmer, more compassionate, gives me more patience. It makes me more attentive, not just to myself, but to the world around me. And I'm not saying that that's necessarily easy. So I've talked about science being good for us, but I talked about silence being good for us rather, and the science behind it. But I want to stress that silence can be challenging and difficult. because the world is really noisy and doesn't really want us to be quiet. As I said, it's designed to fill up every available moment of silence with noise, and there has to be balance. Sometimes having the music on really loud as you drive or as you clean or whatever you're doing is the absolute best thing for you. And I know people who can cultivate inner silence in the midst of noise, but that's definitely not me. And I also know people who find silence really difficult. The idea of sitting still, of not having any input, is potentially terrifying, but also really difficult and hard work. And I agree, it's really hard work to try and look inward. And a lot of the work that I talked about, that I'll talk about a bit later, where I've grown as a person, is work, requires effort. But also there is the challenge of knowing when to accept or embrace silence. Because I talked about how silence is important, and offering people your silence, whether that's just to let their bad days pass you by, whether that's to offer them silence for them to fill with their emotions when they are distraught or concerned, or even offering somebody silence for them to fill with their words, can be the absolute most powerful and special thing that we can offer to somebody. But also remaining silent in the face of injustice. Remaining silent when others choose to speak out about something you have words to say on. That's a challenge. The quote that I read from Martin Luther King: "The ultimate tragedy is not the oppression and cruelty by the bad people, but that the good choose to remain silent in the face of that opposition and cruelty." That when we are faced with things, it's not that bad things are allowed to happen that can be the worst thing, it's that good people let them happen by remaining quiet. And that really is a challenge. But my response would be personally that I think that the time in contemplative prayer and silence that I spend connects me better to the world and to God, would hopefully prompt me into action. But I thought it was important to mention this when I'm talking about silence, because silence can sometimes damage us. If we remain in a place where we reflect and never change and never go into action, then I think we can be doing ourselves and potentially the world more harm than good. A contemplative silence, a silence that makes change, for me, is one that leads to action. At theological college, we get taught something called theological reflection in a cycle. To explain it very simply is that something happens, you gather information about that thing, you reflect on it, then you choose to make an action. Then something happens and the cycle begins again. For me, I see the silence that I'm talking about as very much a part of that reflection stage. We live our lives, things happen in and around and to us. In our silence, we reflect those before God and before ourselves. And then that silence helps us and helps us to hear God guiding us to what to do next. And sometimes the bravest and most sensible and compassionate thing we can do is to break a silence. And so, having talked about how silence has helped me and challenged me, I want to talk about the most important part of my lecture now, which is that silence is spiritually important to me. So those of you who've ever tuned into a quiet space or reflection service that I've led will realise that I rely very heavily on contemplative and meditative prayer in that side of my ministry. this is a type of prayer that I hadn't come across until much later in my Christian journey than I would have liked. But interestingly, it's something that my soul was yearning for and longing for long before I ever discovered it. Before I knew what contemplative prayer even was, I sought to take just little chunks of my day to make Sabbath of them. So instead of spending every day just doing things and having a 5-minute break with a coffee, I would spend that 5-minute break in silence, just looking to pause and come before God. And that is contemplation, because silence helps us spiritually. The quote from the beginning of this lecture about this is from William Penn and says, "True silence is the rest of the mind. It is to the spirit what sleep is to the body, nourishment and refreshment." You know, Jesus went off away from the disciples and the crowds. And I can't help but think that that was to cultivate some kind of quiet, to go away in silence to come before his Father. I think of Jesus escaping the crowds because of their noise and expectations. And I wonder if for him, coming into a space where he could be quiet was that time to reconnect with who he was, both in connecting with his Father, with his godly nature, and also being able to rest in his full humanity. And we know God speaks through silence and through stillness. The Psalms talk about being still and knowing God. And when Elijah is listening and desperately wanting to seek God, it's not through the earthquake or the wind or the fire that he hears him, but it's through the still, small voice. And there is a place in worship for noise and over-exuberance and dance and all of these things. But in contemplation, you come to a place where I think we draw, or certainly I draw closer to God than I do in many other ways. So we draw closer to God in contemplation. For me, drawing into silent prayer is reminding myself that the Holy Spirit is with me, reminding myself that I am always in the presence of God. I often begin quiet, silent prayer by saying to myself, whether in my head or out loud, "I am here, Lord, and you are with me." I think that reminding ourselves of God's presence is a really powerful thing. Certainly for me, I can go through portions of my day forgetting completely that God is right here with me, living in me, interacting in my day-to-day life. And I find that spending time in the quiet, in the silence, deepens my relationship with him. My closest friends, my husband, my parents, my closest family, I have no problem sitting in silence with them. It's just a part of our relationship. It's part of being comfortable with them, the need not to speak. I have a friend called Helen who, at theological college, somebody once accused us of being antisocial because we were both just sat together in the common room, not speaking, not interacting, just sat. And we both laughed and sort of said afterwards that that's one of the things that we valued most about one another, that we most valued the fact that we could sit together without having to speak. It deepened our relationship. And I think we have that opportunity with God as well. We say to children sometimes that we need them to think of Jesus as their friend, which is true. And so we need to work on that relationship. So coming before God, whether deliberately to listen to what the Holy Spirit could stir up in our hearts, to offer a mixed jumble of emotions or experiences, or simply to sit in companionable silence, surely deepens and strengthens our relationship with God. This idea of contemplation isn't a new one. And I know we talk in the Diocese of Oxford about being courageous and compassionate and contemplative. But we also have a rich history in the Christian faith of Christian mystics and contemplatives, all people who are bound up in the idea of growing your relationship with God through the works of quiet contemplation on who God is. People like Mother Julian, who had visions of God, and people like Teresa of Avila, and St. John of the Cross. Now, at the moment, I'm reading a book about St. John of the Cross. Now, he was a mystic in Spain, and this book by Daniel Munzos, Transformed by the Beloved, goes through his life and his teachings. So St. John of the Cross lived in the 16th century and is perhaps best known for coining the phrase dark night of the soul, which he doesn't see as a bad thing. A lot of the contemplative work is all to do with growing spiritually. You might know of the spiritual practice of the Examen, which is an Ignatian practice, and they come from a book of spiritual practices, spiritual exercises that were written with the intention of helping you be a better follower of Christ. And what this book does is, as you read it, it takes you through some of St. John of the Cross's theories and leads you in exercises where you work to grow your soul and to grow your connection with God. And I think the idea of spiritual growth sometimes is something that we think just happens if we expose ourselves to enough of the Bible or enough sermons or enough music, hymns or books. And of course, all of these things cultivate our souls. Of course, they help grow. But I think there is also an element of needing to engage with the idea of spiritual growth as a practical thing that we do. I'm going to read you just a couple of sections of this book, which have really helped me to grasp this concept. Spiritual formation or spiritual growth, St. John of the Cross says, is about spiritual transformation. It's about growth, movement and change. One of St. John's most important contributions to the history of Christian spirituality is to give a necessary and positive value to the experience of inner functions, like the dark nights of souls themselves. Moments of frustration and paralysis must be faced, but rightly understood and used to become a means of growth. So our inner frustrations and spiritual moments where we feel frozen, moments where we feel distant from God, they are all moments that we can use to grow more in the likeness of Christ. A dark night of a soul is a time where God seems distant, a time where we are faced with a kind of spiritual drought. Yet by pushing through these things, by offering them up to God, we learn from them. It doesn't mean that they aren't painful or difficult, but it gives us new and fresh perspective. And that's what this second quote is all about. From these things is the movement, a change of perception. We no longer see things through the lens of our natural eyes, that is our self-centred human nature. Instead, we begin to see reality through the lenses of God. This in turn affects the way that we relate to all that is around us, from our relationships with others to our jobs and communities, and from our spirituality and faith to our relationship with nature and creation. So, as I said, I feel that contemplation can really change how we interact with others and the world around us. That's one of the reasons that silence and contemplation have been so important to me spiritually, that they've been moments where I really have been able to grow. Before you're ordained, you're asked to go on a retreat, and for me, both of these retreats have been silent. And you know, there's nothing more painful than sitting with a group of people that you know really well at a meal, wanting to talk to them, but having to do so in silence. And trying to get somebody to pass you the salt or the jug of water in silence is also pretty tricky. But those retreats have always been really valuable to me, because there have been times where I've been able to really confront things that I've been struggling with spiritually. To really spend time with God, focusing on me and how I'm doing with Him, and helping myself to rediscover who I am in God's eyes. Both of those retreats were really important moments for me to remember that God has a calling on my life, just as He has on all of our lives. And we might not all have the time or be able to enter into a silent retreat, but we all have time to spend just a little time with God in silence. And silence is beautiful. Or at least I believe silence is beautiful. Debussy says music is the silence between the notes. So I'm no poet or musician, but I try to make the words that I use in sermons, in written reflections, beautiful. I try to say things in a way that conveys what my message is. It's more difficult during COVID because having to record things changes the dynamic of how you say them, but my desire to say things in a beautiful way has to do with how I use silence. Just as a beautiful poem or a beautiful song, often the moments that hold us are the swell and the pause before the next moment, before the chorus, before a change in tempo. Silence conveys all of these things, and I think it can do that in our lives. That sometimes the silence between the big things in our lives is what makes it beautiful. Certainly for me, I've grown the most in silence. That it's been the most significant factor in bringing me from where I was spiritually to where I am now, and I think it will be responsible for taking me further too. And so as we draw to a close with this lecture, I'd like to invite you to enter into a spiritual exercise with me that relies on spending time in silence. If you know this isn't going to be something that you are able to engage with or want to engage with, please feel free to end the lecture now and join me for the question and answer later on. But if you're willing to spend some more time with me, then we're going to try something called centering prayer. I invite you to sit where you can feel comfortable, where you can possibly cultivate some inner silence, to take some intentional deep breaths, and to focus on the silence in your mind. Begin by asking God to remind you of His presence. Perhaps use the words I often pray. I am here, Lord, and you are with me. And when you find your mind wandering, bring it back to the silence and the sensation of focusing on God by using a word or phrase. I usually use the phrase Abba, Father. Let's do that together now. I hope that you found that helpful. Perhaps you were able to cultivate some sense of peace, of relaxing into the presence of God, of the deepening of the relationship. There's lots of resources about contemplative prayer and silence out there. If you want any more information about anything, do please just ask me and I'll hopefully point you in the right direction. But thank you so much for being with me for this Lent lecture, and thank you for bearing with me as I have rambled. And I hope I've been able to share with you just a little of the reasons why I'm excited by silence. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gemma. That wasn't exactly what I was expecting, but then, as I said at the beginning, I wasn't sure what to expect. But it will have given us, I'm sure, lots of food for thought. At 9 o'clock this evening, there's an opportunity to join Gemma and any others who like to come for a discussion, to raise any questions or to make your own comments about the topic. Please do join us. The link is on the website, so you should be able to get in without any difficulty. And if you would care to contribute to the costs of this evening, any contributions will be gratefully received through our Little Giving webpage, also accessible through the website. So thank you for coming. I hope that we may expect to see you again next week or for one of the other lectures in the series. But thank you for coming this evening, and good night.